It was supposed to be a simple day hike. Just me and a few friends, heading up to the ridge to enjoy the view and maybe take some photos before heading back down. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool air, and the trees just beginning to show hints of autumn color. We had done hikes like this a dozen times before, and there was no reason to think this one would be any different. We started out early, the trail stretching ahead of us through the thick forest. The sounds of the city were long gone, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. The deeper into the woods we went, the more peaceful it became. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. And for a while, everything seemed perfect. I could feel the tension from the week melting away with every step. But as we climbed higher, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle change in the air. The forest seemed quieter. The birds and insects that had filled the air with sound earlier, now strangely absent. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. We were getting closer to the ridge, and the anticipation of the view distracted me from the unease that was slowly creeping in. About an hour into the hike, the trail started to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The ground became steeper, rocky, and uneven, forcing us to slow our pace. My friend, Jake, who had been leading the way, began to lag behind. He wasn't the kind of guy to admit he was tired, so when he stopped suddenly, it took a moment for the rest of us to realize he wasn't moving. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Panic started to bubble up inside me as I rushed over to him. He was standing completely still, staring down at his feet. I followed his gaze and froze. Beneath him, the trail had eroded away, revealing a sheer drop below. Jake had come within inches of stepping over the edge. I quickly grabbed his arm and pulled him back to solid ground, my heart racing. The drop was steep, hidden by the thick undergrowth, and the realization that he could have fallen made me feel sick. Jake gave me a weak nod of thanks, but there was something else in his eyes, fear, maybe, or shock. We moved past it, but the mood of the group had changed. The tension was palpable now, a nervous energy that hung in the air as we continued the hike. About 20 minutes later, as we neared the ridge, the trail took a sharp turn. The path was narrow, flanked by dense trees on one side and a steep slope on the other. I remember feeling a growing sense of dread, though I couldn't quite explain why. Everything was still, almost too still, and the forest felt darker, even though it was midday. That's when it happened. One moment, everything was fine, and the next, I heard a sharp gasp behind me. I spun around just in time to see Claire, one of the strongest hikers in our group, stumble. Her foot had slipped on a loose patch of gravel, and before any of us could react, she was falling. There was no time to scream, no time to reach out to help. She disappeared over the edge of the trail, her body tumbling down the steep slope, hitting rocks and branches as she went. We rushed to the edge, but it was too late. She was gone, lying motionless far below. A wave of horror washed over me. My legs felt weak, and I could barely comprehend what had just happened. One minute she was with us, and the next she was dead. The reality hit like a punch to the gut. Claire, the one we had all relied on for her calm and strength, was gone, and there was nothing we could do. The group fell into chaos. Some of us wanted to scramble down to her, while others shouted that we needed to get help. But the terrain was too dangerous, and there was no cell service up here. I felt trapped, my mind racing with a mix of fear, guilt, and helplessness. The hike had turned into a nightmare in an instant, and the thought of having to leave Claire behind to get help felt unbearable. As we stood there, frozen by the weight of what had happened, I couldn't help but feel the forest closing in on us. The trees, which had once felt peaceful and welcoming, now loomed over us, dark and menacing. The quiet was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. Every step felt like a betrayal as we turned back down the trail, leaving Claire behind. By the time we reached the bottom, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. We managed to find a signal and call for help, but even then, the weight of the day wouldn't lift. The hike that had started out as an escape from the stress of everyday life had ended in tragedy. And though I know it wasn't my fault, the image of Claire falling, disappearing into the trees below, haunts me still. A few summers ago, I rented an old farmhouse for a weekend getaway. It seemed perfect, a rustic place far from the city, complete with a big yard, a pool, and the tranquility we all needed. My wife, Julianne, and our 2 kids, Liam and Zoe, were excited as we arrived on that sunny Friday afternoon, eager to unwind. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long, gravel road, surrounded by dense trees. It had creaky wooden steps that led up to a wide porch, and inside, the house was just as I'd imagined. Antique furniture, old black and white photos lining the walls, and a faint musty smell that hinted at its age. It felt like stepping back in time, but in a way that was comforting. We spent the afternoon unpacking, and then headed out to the pool. The kids splashed around while Julianne and I sat on the edge, dipping our feet into the cool water. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only find in remote places. But as the sun began to set, a creeping sense of unease settled in, subtle at first. It was the sound of something, footsteps, perhaps, crunching on dried leaves nearby. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it must have been some wildlife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. The noise came again, louder this time, closer. I glanced at Julianne, who seemed not to notice. I brushed it off, not wanting to spoil the evening with unnecessary worry. We gathered our things as the sky darkened and headed inside, locking the door behind us. The farmhouse felt safe, its thick walls and heavy wooden beams providing a sense of security. After putting the kids to bed, I went around checking the doors and windows, more out of habit than actual concern. The night passed quietly until I was jolted awake sometime after midnight by a loud knock at the door. It was a strange, insistent pounding that echoed through the otherwise silent house. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, wondering who could be knocking at this hour in such a remote area. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking continued, more urgent now. I hesitated before grabbing a flashlight and creeping toward the front door. Through the peephole, I could make out a figure standing outside. It was a man wearing what looked like a uniform. There was no reason for anyone to be there, and something about the situation felt off. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The man outside grew more impatient, and then I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I heard the sound of multiple footsteps moving around the house. Suddenly, I realized there were others with him, circling the farmhouse. Fear gripped me as I quietly backed away from the door. I didn't want to risk turning on the lights, not wanting to draw more attention to the fact that we were inside, awake and fully aware. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Julianne and the kids were still upstairs, sleeping. The house, which had felt so safe earlier, now felt like a trap. I ran upstairs, quietly waking Julianne and telling her to take the kids into one of the bedrooms. We locked ourselves in, sitting in tense silence as we listened to the sounds of footsteps outside. Every few minutes, the creaking of the old wooden porch echoed through the house. Then, we heard the unmistakable sound of a window being rattled, as though someone was testing each one, looking for a way in. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of how long we could hold out. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. At some point, I heard glass shattering downstairs, followed by footsteps inside the house. They were in. The intruders moved through the farmhouse, room by room, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. I could hear them checking closets, opening doors, as though they knew exactly where to look. My breath was shallow, fear clawing at my chest as I realized that they would soon reach the stairs. Just when it felt like there was no hope, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The intruders must have heard them too, because the footsteps became frantic, and soon, there was the sound of doors slamming and the back door creaking open. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until everything went silent again. The police arrived shortly after, but by the time they searched the house, the intruders were long gone. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. One of the officers called me outside to show me something they had found near the back of the house. There, lying in the grass by the edge of the woods, was a crumpled police uniform. the same kind the man at the door had been wearing. As I picked it up, my heart sank. Stuffed inside the pocket was a wallet, and when I opened it, my hands trembled. Inside was a photo of me, along with my name and address. They hadn't just stumbled onto the farmhouse. They knew exactly who I was. They were looking for me. I worked the night shift at a gas station in rural New Hampshire. It was a quiet job, perfect for someone who likes solitude, but there were moments when the isolation could get to you. The nights were usually calm, with only the occasional customer stopping by to fill up their tank or grab a snack. That night, though, the air felt different, heavy, almost oppressive. There was a strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Around midnight, an old car pulled up to the pump. It looked like it had seen better days, rust creeping up its sides. Out stepped an elderly man, moving slowly, deliberately, as if every step took great effort. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, his white hair neatly combed. Something about him seemed off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. He entered the store, and I greeted him with a friendly, "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" He didn't respond, just nodded slightly and began walking around the aisles, his eyes scanning the shelves without any real focus. A strange unease settled in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. After a few minutes, he approached the counter with a small bottle of water and a pack of gum. "Will that be all?" I asked, ringing up his items. Again, he didn't respond, just nodded, his eyes fixed on me. His gaze was unsettling, cold and sharp, like he was seeing right through me. I handed him his change, and as I did, he suddenly reached out and gripped my wrist. His touch was ice cold, and a shiver ran down my spine. He leaned in, his voice barely more than a whisper, but each word felt like a weight pressing down on me. "Hell is a real place, you know," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "And the devil already has his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak. His words hung in the air, heavy, ominous. After what felt like an eternity, he released my wrist, took his items, and walked out of the store without another word. I watched him drive away, the taillights of his car disappearing into the darkness. My heart was pounding, the old man's words echoing in my mind. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just crazy, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave me. The store was empty again. The only sounds the soft buzz of the overhead lights and the hum of the refrigerators. But the stillness felt different now, suffocating, as if the very air was charged with something dark and unseen. I finished my shift, locked up the store, and drove home, but the old man's words wouldn't stop repeating in my head. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, something I had never done before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling like someone or something was watching me. The next day, I told one of my co-workers about the encounter, expecting him to laugh it off. And he did, joking that the old man was probably just some harmless weirdo. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something real. A heavy weight seemed to settle in my chest, as if a dark cloud was hanging over me. Weeks passed, and the memory of the old man began to fade, though I still felt uneasy whenever I worked the night shift. One night, while I was restocking shelves, I heard it, a faint whisper. It was barely audible, but it stopped me in my tracks. I turned around, but there was no one there. The store was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back to work, but the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around me, though I couldn't make out the words. Panic started to rise in my chest, my heart beating faster as the air in the store grew colder. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but again, there was no one there. My breath came in short gasps, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. I ran to the front of the store and grabbed my phone, dialing my co-worker with trembling fingers. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. The memory of the old man's warning flooded back, and with it, a surge of terror I couldn't explain. Just then, the door chime rang, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was the old man, his eyes locked onto mine as he walked slowly toward me, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. "Hell is a real place," he said again, his voice sending a chill down my spine. "And the devil already has his hand on you." It was a warm summer evening, one of those nights where the air felt thick and still, almost suffocating in its silence. I had planned a small dinner party with my closest friends. There was no particular reason for it. I just wanted everyone together to share a nice evening. I spent the day cooking roasted chicken, freshly baked bread, and I had saved a special bottle of red wine. The table was set perfectly, with the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room. Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and John arrived on time, as they always did. Laughter filled the hallway as we exchanged hugs, everything feeling so familiar, so comfortable. Then there was Tom. He had moved to town recently, and although none of us knew him well, I thought it would be nice to include him, to make him feel welcome. Tom arrived a little late, his face flushed, and he offered an awkward smile as he stepped inside. I noticed how he avoided making eye contact, his gaze constantly shifting, flickering around the room like he was searching for something. The evening began as usual. We gathered around the table, passing dishes, sharing stories, and laughing. But Tom, seated at the end of the table, remained quiet. His face was half hidden in the dim light, and although he smiled politely when someone spoke to him, there was something distant in his demeanor. It felt as though he wasn't fully present, like his mind was elsewhere, absorbed in something only he could see. As the night wore on, Tom's silence became more pronounced. He barely touched his food, and I caught him staring down at his plate more than once, his hand trembling slightly as he cut into his chicken. Every few minutes, his eyes darted toward the door, like he was waiting for someone or something to arrive. A strange chill began to creep up my spine. Maybe he was just shy, I thought. Maybe this kind of gathering wasn't his thing. But there was a part of me, deep down, that sensed something was wrong. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Glasses of wine in hand, we lounged on the couches, reminiscing about old stories and laughing at inside jokes. The atmosphere should have felt relaxed, but I couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable Tom was becoming. He sat apart from the group, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair tightly, his knuckles white. His breathing had become shallow, and he avoided eye contact entirely. It was clear now something was very wrong. Then, out of nowhere, Tom stood up abruptly, knocking his glass over. The wine spilled across the carpet, a deep red stain spreading quickly. He muttered something under his breath, something none of us could make out, and without a second glance, hurried toward the door. Before any of us could say a word, he was gone. The door slammed so hard that the walls seemed to shake from the force of it. We all froze. The warmth and laughter that had filled the room moments earlier vanished instantly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice low, almost a whisper. What was that about? None of us had an answer. We sat there for a while, stunned, the evening's joy shattered by Tom's strange, unsettling exit. The rest of the night was awkward. We tried to continue the conversations, but it felt forced, the shadow of Tom's abrupt departure hanging over us. Eventually, everyone said their goodbyes, and I was left alone in the house. The silence was unnerving. I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, my thoughts kept drifting back to Tom. I couldn't explain why I was so fixated on his behavior, but the way he had acted last night, the anxiety in his eyes, the constant glances at the door, it gnawed at me, refusing to let go. By the afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to stop by his house to check on him, just to make sure everything was okay. When I arrived, Tom's car was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I called out his name, but there was only silence. A strange unease crept over me, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he had gone out for a walk, or maybe he just needed some space after last night. Days passed, and still no word from Tom. I reached out to my friends, but none of them had heard from him either. Finally, I I called the police, explaining what had happened and expressing my concern. They promised to look into it, but as the weeks dragged on, there was still no sign of him. The police had no leads. His house remained eerily quiet, his car still parked in the driveway, and all his belongings untouched inside. It was as if Tom had vanished into thin air. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about that night. The way he had acted, the fear, the tension, it haunted me. Something had terrified him, something that he couldn't put into words. And now, that same fear had settled into my life, an ever-present weight pressing down on me, as though whatever had scared Tom was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. It was late September when my friends and I decided to go for a night drive. The air was crisp, with just a hint of cold as autumn crept in. We were bored and restless, craving some kind of adventure. It was one of those nights where the quiet felt unsettling, as if something was waiting to happen. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, Sam, and Jenny. We piled into Alex's car and drove aimlessly for a while, laughing and playing music, the windows down as we let the cold air wake us up. Soon, our conversation turned to local ghost stories. Someone mentioned an old abandoned house at the edge of town, a place that had been empty for years. "We should go there," Sam suggested, his grin wide and mischievous. It was thrilling, the kind of suggestion that made your stomach flip, half out of excitement, half out of fear. Despite our hesitation, we all agreed. We turned the car toward the house. As we got closer, the roads became narrower, the trees taller, their branches stretching overhead like twisted fingers. When we finally saw the house, a chill ran down my spine. It stood at the end of a long, gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall grass. It was big, looming with broken windows and a sagging roof, the kind of place that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb it. The car's headlights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, making the house look even more sinister. We parked a little down the road, not wanting to draw too much attention. As we walked toward the house, the air grew colder, and the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel echoed unnervingly in the night. My heart was beating faster than usual, and I could tell my friends were feeling the same unease. When we reached the front door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, Alex pushed it open. It creaked loudly, the sound cutting through the silence, and we stepped inside. The air inside the house was musty and thick. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. The house felt like it was frozen in time, like it hadn't been touched in decades. A heavy sense of dread settled in my chest, but we tried to brush it off, laughing nervously as we began exploring. We split up. Jenny and I went upstairs while Alex and Sam stayed on the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed, each step echoing in the silence. Upstairs, the rooms were filled with old furniture, covered in dusty white sheets. Broken picture frames lined the walls, their glass cracked, and cobwebs clung to every corner. It felt like the house was watching us, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs, a sound that sent a shockwave of fear through my body. "Alex? Sam?" Jenny called out, but there was no answer. We rushed down the stairs, our footsteps thundering in the empty house. The living room was empty, but the front door, the door we had left open, was now closed. I felt my heart race, a sharp, icy fear gripping me. Something wasn't right. "Let's find them and get out of here," I said, my voice shaky. We searched the house, checking each room quickly, our nerves on edge. The kitchen was empty, the dining room too. Finally, we reached a small storage room at the back of the house. The door was ajar, and as we stepped inside, we found Alex and Sam standing completely still, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They didn't answer at first, just stared down at the floor. When I followed their gaze, I saw it an open trapdoor leading down into the basement. The dark hole seemed to swallow all the light around it, an oppressive blackness that made my stomach churn. "Did you open it?" I asked. Sam shook his head slowly. It was already open. A cold draft came up from the basement, the air thick and damp. Against my better judgment, we decided to go down. The narrow, wooden ladder creaked under our weight, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The basement was freezing, far colder than it should have been. Shelves lined the walls, covered in dust, filled with jars and old tools. In the corner, a dim light flickered, a lantern, hanging from a nail in the wall, barely illuminating the room. That's when we heard it footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from above us. Someone else was in the house. We turned off our flashlights, standing still, holding our breath. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward the trapdoor. Panic surged through me as I realized we had no way out. The footsteps stopped right above us, and then the trapdoor began to creak open. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the faint light from the living room. My blood ran cold. He was tall, his hair wild, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He began climbing down the ladder, slowly, methodically. We backed away, trying to stay out of his sight. He muttered to himself, words we couldn't understand, as he searched the basement. Without warning, he turned and looked directly at us. His eyes locked onto mine, and a cold, twisted smile spread across his face. We bolted, scrambling up the ladder, our hearts racing. Pure terror fueled us as we ran out of the house, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't speak, too shaken by what had happened. Our once thrilling adventure turning into a nightmare we would never forget. I grew up in a quiet town where nothing ever really happened. Most people knew each other, and life moved slowly, predictably. Our house was on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles, broken only by a line of trees in the distance. It was peaceful, or at least it had been, until the new neighbors moved in. The house next door had been empty for as long as I could remember. It was a large, old place that stood out against the flat landscape. Its windows were always dark, the paint peeling from its walls. There were rumors about the house, whispers of bad luck and tragic endings, but no one really knew why it had stayed vacant for so long. When a family finally moved in, everyone was surprised. At first, I didn't notice much about them. They kept to themselves, and I wasn't one to pry. The first few weeks were quiet, but then strange things started happening. It began with noises, scratching sounds at night, faint but persistent, coming from their side of the fence. I told myself it was just animals, but the sounds grew louder and more frequent, like something or someone was moving through the brush outside. One evening, as I was walking to my car, I noticed something odd. The light in their house was on, but instead of the warm glow you'd expect, it flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the ground. I stared at it for a moment, a cold sensation creeping up my spine. There was something about that house that felt wrong. I couldn't quite explain it, but it made my skin crawl. A few days later, I saw the family for the first time. They were standing in their yard, but they didn't look like they were doing anything. They were just standing there, too still, staring out toward the fields. The father had his hands in his pockets, the mother beside him, her face blank. The two children were further away, barely visible through the tall grass. I watched them for a few minutes, waiting for them to move, but they never did. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I stayed still, listening, my heart racing. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving across the yard. I peeked through the blinds, but all I saw was darkness. Yet the footsteps continued, now circling the house. Panic started to rise in me, but I didn't move. I didn't dare turn on the light. When the morning came, everything seemed normal again. I told myself it must have been a dream, but the unease lingered. The following evening, I decided to keep the lights off and sit by the window just to watch. The sky darkened, and soon, the only light came from the neighbor's flickering lamp. I waited, staring out at the yard, the fence, the line of trees in the distance. And then I saw it, a figure. It was standing near the edge of their property, just inside the fence. I could barely make it out, but it was tall and still, blending into the night. For a moment, I thought it was the father again, but something was different. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I kept my eyes on it, waiting for it to move, but it didn't. Hours seemed to pass, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I was watching. Eventually, I forced myself to look away. When I glanced back, the figure was gone, but that didn't bring relief. In fact, it only made the fear worse. I went to bed, though I didn't sleep. The next morning, I couldn't resist taking a closer look. I walked to the fence line, the grass wet with dew. There was no sign of anyone, but as I moved closer to their house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of dirt, freshly disturbed, lay near their back porch. The kind of dirt you'd expect from someone digging a hole. I stepped back quickly, my pulse racing. That evening, the flickering light in their house was gone. The windows were dark, and the yard was empty. I didn't hear any footsteps that night, but the silence felt heavier than before, like the air itself was thick with dread. Days passed, and I didn't see the family again. The house stood dark and still, as if no one had ever lived there. Then one day, a few weeks later, I noticed a for sale sign in their yard. They had left just like that, without a word. No one ever explained what happened, and I never asked. But whenever I pass that house now, I feel a chill run through me, a reminder of the nights I spent waiting, listening to those footsteps, wondering what was really going on next door. The lake house was supposed to be our retreat from the chaos of everyday life. My wife and I had bought it last spring, imagining peaceful weekends spent by the water, watching the sun dip below the trees. It was secluded miles from any other house, nestled deep in the woods. At first, that was what we loved about it, the isolation, the quiet. But after a while, the quiet became something else, something unnerving. We had only spent a few weekends there, but this time was different. From the moment we arrived, the air felt heavier, like the atmosphere had shifted. I noticed it as soon as I stepped out of the car. The usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, almost absent. The lake, normally glistening with sunlight, looked darker, its surface smooth and still like black glass. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just the weather, but a knot of unease settled in my chest. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. It was an old place, creaky and drafty, but this time the cold seemed to seep into my bones. I went about my usual routine, unpacking bags, lighting a fire, trying to push the unease away. But something about the silence of the house made every movement feel amplified. The rustle of my clothes, the clinking of dishes, all of it seemed louder, as if the walls were listening. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My wife, always sensitive to my moods, looked more tired than usual, retreating to bed earlier. The unease was spreading, growing, and I couldn't explain it. The fire crackled, the shadows on the walls danced, but the silence outside was oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. Later, as I finally climbed into bed, I noticed a small dark shape in the corner of the room. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim light, but when I focused on it, I felt my stomach turn. It was an animal, a squirrel, maybe motionless, curled up near the dresser. It must have gotten in somehow, but something was wrong. It didn't move. I got up and went closer, curiosity driving me. That's when I noticed it wasn't sleeping. The squirrel was dead. Its body was cold, stiff, lying there as if it had dropped dead in mid-motion. I felt a strange revulsion sweep over me. I didn't know how it had gotten in, and I certainly didn't understand why it had died like that. No wounds, no struggle, just lifeless. A sense of dread settled in my chest. I tried to push it out of my mind, but something about it unnerved me. The next morning, I went to show my wife the squirrel, only to find that it was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, as if it had never been there at all. A cold fear crept into my thoughts. Had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't mention it to my wife, convinced I was overreacting, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, as we sat by the lake, my wife complained about feeling dizzy, her face pale. She collapsed without warning, slumping onto the ground before I could even react. I rushed to her side, panic rising, but she was already unconscious. I screamed for help, though I knew no one was near, my heart pounding as I tried to shake her awake. She came to after a few minutes, confused but insisting she was fine. I wasn't convinced, but there was nothing else I could do. We returned to the house, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent a chill through me. The lake, usually so full of life, was dark and unmoving, a black void that seemed to swallow all sound. That evening, I heard it again, the tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the windows. This time it was louder, more aggressive, as if something or someone was trying to get in. I checked the windows, finding nothing but the black reflection of my own face staring back at me in the glass. The tapping moved, circling the house, relentless. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding. The trees were dense, their shadows long in the fading light, but I saw no movement, no sign of anyone. The house loomed behind me, and the lake beyond it was disturbingly still. Something wasn't right. The next morning, we packed up and left, leaving behind the peace we thought we would find. Whatever had caused the unease, the tapping, and the strange feeling of being watched wasn't gone. It was waiting somewhere out there in the silence by the lake. I had driven that stretch of road hundreds of times before. It cut through miles of dense forest, winding and narrow, but was the quickest way to get to my cabin. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches heavy with leaves, casting long shadows that made the road feel more isolated than it already was. It was a peaceful drive during the day, but at night, it had a different energy. The darkness seemed thicker there, the road somehow longer, more oppressive. I had left later than planned that evening, so by the time I was halfway there, it was pitch black. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only the narrow path ahead. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to push aside the sense of unease that always crept in when I drove alone at night. About 20 minutes from the cabin, I spotted something in the distance, a figure on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, standing motionless near the edge of the woods. He wasn't hitchhiking or waving for help. He was just standing there, watching the road. My first instinct was to speed up, but as I passed, I caught a glimpse of his face. Something about it chilled me. His expression was blank, almost lifeless, as if he wasn't fully aware of where he was. For the next few minutes, I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. There was something about him that felt wrong. I tried to convince myself he was just some guy out for a walk, but deep down, I knew better. No one would be walking out there at this time of night, not in the middle of nowhere. About 5 miles later, I saw him again. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The same figure standing in the same position on the side of the road. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. I told myself it must have been a coincidence, someone who just looked like him. But the knot of fear in my stomach tightened. I kept driving, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of highway fading into the dark. I forced myself to focus, trying to push aside the rising panic. When I finally reached the turnoff for my cabin, I breathed a sigh of relief. The narrow dirt road led deeper into the woods, and after a few more minutes, I arrived at the cabin. The place was just as I'd left it, quiet, still, nestled among the trees. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cool night air, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I walked toward the front door, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the distance, just at the edge of the tree line, was the figure. The same man. He was standing still, watching me, his face hidden in the shadows. A cold wave of dread washed over me. There was no explanation for how he could have followed me, and the realization that I was being watched hit me like a punch to the gut. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The silence inside the cabin felt stifling, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I checked all the windows, making sure they were locked, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching. The fear gnawed at me, creeping into every corner of my mind. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Every sound outside made me jump. The creak of the trees in the wind, the rustle of leaves. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window, too afraid of what I might see. By morning, the fear hadn't lifted. I packed up my things and left the cabin as quickly as I could. As I pulled away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. But the road was empty, the woods silent. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. I tell myself it was just a coincidence, that it was all in my head. But sometimes, late at night, I still see his face, the blank expression, the way he just stood there waiting. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, watching. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you